What I want to talk about tonight is to warn Canada not to go down the same Islamic road that Europe finds itself on, and particularly so Britain, which is almost on the point of no return, or certainly perhaps not on a peaceful return. Samuel Huntingdon was not necessarily writing about Britain when he penned his prescient book, The Clash of Civilizations, but one particular theme he raised in this book, which is very pertinent to our situation now, he called the illusion of permanency. Now, no one in Britain expects tomorrow to be particularly different to today, or next year, or the year after that. People find it inconceivable that tomorrow could be radically different from today. But there are certain things which have happened in Britain over the last 50 years that will make the next 50 years a period of total, complete, and utter transformation. And the reason for this is very simple: mass immigration and Muslim demographics. Now, when I talk about the illusion of permanency, this illusion is very easy to maintain when the British people are racially, as they have been for hundreds and hundreds of years, and when the Muslim population in Britain numbered only in the tens of thousands, as was the case in the 1960s. But this is no longer the situation. Tony Blair's government opened the doors to mass immigration with the express intention of destroying traditional British culture. And the cat was let out of the bag a couple of years ago by one of Tony Blair's speechwriters, a Mr. Andrew Neither, who rather foolishly stated in public that the ambition of the Labour Party was to change the cultural face of Great Britain and to rub the noses of the right wing in multicultural diversity. Well, they've been very successful, which is hardly surprising because Britain is a tiny country. It makes up less than 1% of the world's habitable landmass. It contains less than 1% of the world's population. And on top of that, we have an extremely generous welfare benefits society. Immigrants, third world immigrants, can come to Britain and live far better lives than they can in their countries of origin. So when you have a relatively rich, very generous, tiny country like Britain, which effectively opens its doors to the billions of impoverished third world people, you can only reasonably expect to be swamped. And Britain today has been swamped. Sam Solomon wrote a book about Islamic immigration called The Trojan Horse, and he describes the jihadist ideology behind mass immigration. And the liberal left denounce this, of course, because they're not totally well informed, to put it mildly. But the Islamists understand only too well the benefits of infiltration. Abu Basir is a London-based spiritual advisor to Ansar al-Islam, which is yet another British-based London jihadist organisation. And he had the following to say about Islamic immigration to the West. One of the goals of immigration is the revival of jihad and the enforcement of power over the infidels. One is dependent upon the continuance of the other, and the continuance, and dependent upon it. The continuance of immigration is dependent upon the continuance of jihad. Or how about Colonel Gaddafi, who stated, "We have 50 million Muslims in Europe. There are signs that Allah will grant Islam victory. Within a bare few decades, Islam will turn Europe into an Islamic continent." Thank you, Richard. Now, such honest and forthright statements of absolute clear intent go right over the heads of our left-wing politicians. One of them, a former Labour minister, Tony Benn, vies with your very own Pierre Trudeau, presumably, about being one of the more deluded people in politics in the West at the moment. And about multiculturalism, he had this to say: "This diversity provides a delightful snapshot of life in multicultural Britain. The world today is such a small place So we are very lucky to have so many people from so many different backgrounds in Britain. Multicultural Britain is now here to stay, so it's great that we are now finally getting to live alongside each other. Now, this naivety is astonishing, bordering almost on the criminal. But not all the liberal left suffer from such delusions. Patricia Morgan, who writes for Roger Scruton's Salisbury Review magazine, had a leftist friend who was experiencing misgivings about mass immigration into Britain, and she asked him why, and he said he had always been keen on getting as many immigrants into Britain as possible in order to further the revolution. In order to further the revolution. And while it hadn't been possible to storm Buckingham Palace and set up Soviets in Westminster, it was possible to change the population and supplant the hated other. Supplant the hated other. What a wicked and treacherous notion that is. And who is the hated other? We all know who he was talking about at the time: the bourgeoisie, the fat cat capitalists, the successful middle classes. But this astonishing attack on the British people, it's not them who've been supplanted. The bourgeoisie are still there, the fat cat capitalists are still there, the bankers are living high on the hog even as I speak. The people who have been supplanted are the working class people of Britain. The population that has essentially been ethnically cleansed by a bloodless genocide are the traditional working class people of Britain. The people who once lived in the East End of London, the chirpy cockneys, the men and women that the Luftwaffe were unable to bomb out of London, the men and women who stoically carrying on even as their roads and houses were burning, and they gave the double fingers to Adolf Hitler and totalitarianism. But now they've gone, cleansed from the land they so recently fought for, and what Adolf failed to do, the left-wing traitors in alliance with Islam have succeeded in doing beyond their wildest, most twisted expectations. Our population has already been supplanted. The hated other, the native working class Brit, has pretty much been defeated. And if we want to look to our future, then we need only look at our primary schools. In London, white British children now account for only 20%. And I'll say that again, only 20% of the school population. And England's other city schools are going precisely the same way in precisely the same manner. The non-indigenous birth rate now averages 35% nationally, which realistically means 70 to 80% in our cities. This basically consigns indigenous English children in Luton, Birmingham, London, Leicester, Burnley, Oldham into an ethnic minority today. And within another 10 years, every city in the country, the children will be an ethnic minority, and by 2030, this will be the case across the entire country. And the fact that this has been accomplished deliberately in order to further leftist revolutionary ideology is treason. It can only be described as treason. And during Tony Blair's government, the British Embassy in Pakistan was actually handing out leaflets encouraging Muslims to emigrate to Britain, and in the leaflets there was very clear instructions on how to go about claiming money from the welfare state. And the chief official in Britain who was charged with monitoring visa applications at this time, Linda Costello-Baker, told a House of Commons Select Committee that her department was under intense political pressure to issue visas because it was easier to let them in than to reject applications. And over the term of the Labour government, this 15% amounted to several million people who should never have been allowed into Britain in the first place, and amongst them there were terrorists, murderers, rapists and paedophiles who had been convicted in their countries of origin. And exact population figures in Britain are hard to come by. The authorities maintain there are 60 million people in Britain, but the independent newspaper a couple of years ago estimated the true figure to be about 78 million people, and this is backed up by the number of national insurance cards in existence, which are now numbering 76 million. So there are something like 16 million more people in Britain than the authorities will admit to. Now, clearly, not all immigrants are Muslims, but they make up a majority of the immigrant population. And their high birth rate, which averages 4 children per woman, and I'm not going to say couple, because Muslim males can claim housing benefit and welfare costs for up to 4 different wives and countless children, even though polygamy is illegal in Britain. So it's this, coupled with mass immigration, that has essentially doubled their population every decade since the 1960s, when there were only approximately 60 million Muslims in Britain. By 1990, that figure had reached 1 million, by 2000, 2 million, and the latest estimates, something around 3 to 4 million in Britain at the moment. And this is why the next 50 years will be nothing like the last 50 years. When the Muslim population doubled from 50,000 to 100,000, nobody really cared. Nobody was really affected by this, except for the people who were living in the emerging Muslim enclaves. But when the 3 million of today become 6 million in 2020, become 12 million, become 24 million, then everyone is affected, because at that point, my country, the country I grew up in, will effectively have gone, completely gone. And it gets worse because the indigenous British are only having about 1.5 children each, which effectively means the generation born today is 25% smaller than their parents' generation. And the population pyramids of most European countries are upside down, so the elderly greatly outnumber the young, but the Muslim population pyramids are the right way up, where the young greatly outnumber the old. So if you look at the population of Great Britain today, and this is important, not across the entire spectrum, but aged under 40, aged only under 40. If we look at this, then the indigenous population today is 25 million, and the non-indigenous population is 6.75 million. But if we take into account our declining birth rates and their expanding birth rates, if we push these figures forward to 2030, which is just 18 years from now, we find ourselves facing a potential catastrophe, because the figures then, in 2030, again this is aged under 40, the figures for the indigenous population will be 19 million, and for the non-indigenous population 13 million. But it gets worse again, because the indigenous Brits, sick to the back teeth of multicultural Britain, are emigrating at about 250,000 a year. So again, if we project this forward as well, and we take into account continued mass immigration as it's been going on for the last 10-15 years, then by that point the indigenous population is now down to 15 million, and the non-indigenous population 23 million. So under the age of 40, we will have become an ethnic minority in our own country. And the liberal left will sneer at this. So what, they'll say? So what? It's multiculturalism in action, and if you're against it, you must be a racist, a Nazi, a fascist, or a bigot. But suppose they're wrong. You know, suppose young, indoctrinated, fanatical Muslim males don't share the same fluffy idea of multiculturalism that the liberal left do, and they want to impose on us a very unpleasant, monocultural Islam. And they're going to. And I use the younger population figures for 2 reasons. The first is to show our immediate demographic future, and the second really is the important one, which is the fact that the 18 to 40-year-old demographic is of military fighting age. And it doesn't matter if they're outnumbered today by a superior number of elderly grey-haired Brits. The only thing that matters is that they will very soon outnumber our young indigenous potential defenders. Is this right-wing hysteria? Is this right-wing paranoia? It's not. People grounded in reality understand that the entire history of man is war. The liberal left, and their naive, sentimental way, think the history of man is peace. The future, of man is peace. No matter that all the evidence, all the history runs totally counter to this. And already we see this racial and religious division everywhere in Britain. Surveys now suggest that 40% of British Muslims wish to live under Sharia law. There are constant news about the radicalisation of young Muslim males. And just a few years ago, we saw thousands and thousands of Muslims celebrating in the streets of Great Britain, after the terrible, wicked mass murder in New York on 9/11. We got constant news about thwarted terrorist attacks in London, and this comes on top of the 2005 London transport suicide bombings that killed 52 people and maimed 700. Constant news about mosques selling literature calling for the overthrow of British democracy, constant news about mosques calling for the murder of British Jews and homosexuals, the constant news about the subjugation of the British people and the imposition of a global Islamic caliphate. And this is today. What are we going to see in the future when the 18 to 40-year-old demographic is the one that's actually in power? We only have to look around the world to see the answer, and let me take just one example of Lebanon. Lebanon used to be a majority Christian country, but as the Islamic demographic grew, so did their demand for control. And this triggered in 1975 a 15-year religious civil war, which killed 10% of the population, injured 33%, half of them with lifelong disabilities, and the entire Christian leadership was either jailed, exiled, or murdered. This is probably Britain's future. Britain's security services won't be able to hold back Islamic terrorist attacks forever, and when the next one gets through, I fully expect to see indigenous British hotheads somewhere take revenge by going out and murdering a Muslim somewhere in Britain, or by torching a mosque. And when that happens, this whole tit-for-tat atrocity starts happening. And this is going to get worse and progressively more vicious before the entire country goes the way of the Lebanon, or more recently Yugoslavia, which of course fractured along racial, religious and tribal lines. And this view of future Armageddon will be sneered at again by the liberal left, who continue to bombard us with the lie that Islam is a religion of peace. But of course Islam is not and never has been a religion of peace. Muhammad was a warlord, and a very successful warlord at that, and Islam is a political, social and structural order of supremacy and imperialism. Islam in its most fundamental form is Nazism, in its desire for global supremacy, women fit only for the kitchen, the bedroom, the place of prayer, Jews and homosexuals to be murdered, and all those not of the faith to live their lives as second-class citizens. In fact, Islam is even worse than Nazism. Not even the most vicious of Nazis ever suggested it was permissible to bury an adulterous woman up to her neck in sand, to phone up the cousins and the nephews and the brothers, and to come round and slowly and methodically stone her to death. So what can we do about this in Britain? Even talking about it contravenes all the various new hate laws, which will now send you to prison. And the government and the media are out to demonise anybody who dares to raise the subject. And in the interest of short-term election cycles, the government is quite happy to sweep all of our potential catastrophes under the table simply because they operate on 4-year cycles and nothing longer. But it's too important to ignore, because the very lives of our children are dependent upon what we do today. And there's very little on the horizon to actually change where we're going. The liberal left are very happy with mass immigration because mass immigration provides them with mass votes. The Conservatives simply refuse to talk about it, or if they do, it's only to suggest that Islamic Turkey should join the European Union. And the one party that will talk about it, the British National Party, has quite rightly been sidelined in the eyes of decent British people because they have a very bad history of genuine racial bigotry, and their leader is a Holocaust denier. So this leaves just one party in Britain at the moment that could possibly do something about it, which is the British Freedom Party, which I'm very proud to say I'm the chairman of. And we want to stop any further third world mass immigration, and we want to stop the Islamization of Britain. And we can do this by calling a halt to the building of any more mosques, by deporting all foreign-born terrorists and criminals, by refusing welfare payments to polygamous Muslims with large families, by closing down mosques found preaching violence and sedition, and by jailing imams who think it's all right to call for the murder of Jews and homosexuals. In short, to make it difficult for Muslims who wish us harm in Britain to remain living in our country. And I know it all sounds terribly unpleasant, but unless we do something like this, we are probably heading for a civil war that will make the breakup of Yugoslavia pale into insignificance. And we didn't make those colossal sacrifices between 1939 to 1945 in order, just a few decades later, to very meekly and abjectly surrender to a totalitarian ideology redolent of Islam itself. Now, we're not going to allow a 7th century doctrine of religious imperialism excuse me, and who view our innate sense of decency, morality and generosity simply as signs of Western weaknesses which they can seize and use against us. We're not going to allow Islam to take their slow, steady, incremental control of Great Britain without at least putting up some sort of resistance. And I hope, I really desperately hope that we're not too far gone yet, even if your Mark Stein has already written us off. But I'm going to close now by just asking that Canadians keep a close eye on what's happening in Europe and particularly in Britain, and to call a halt today, right now, immediately, to any further expansion of Islamic ideology and demographic growth in Canada. Don't make the same mistakes that Britain has done, and you can see this. Now, I'm going to fight for Britain. I'm prepared to lay down my life for Britain, but there's no guarantee that we're going to win this. There's no guarantee that Europe's going to win this. And if we go, and if North America goes shortly thereafter, then this is the illusion of permanency. Now, this has happened. Civilizations end. And we're looking at that situation right now. And if Western civilization goes, this is one of the kindest, most humane, most decent civilizations the world has ever known. And it's going to be replaced with Islam, the most barbaric, illiberal, totalitarian, pathologically cruel regime the world has ever seen. So I'm just going to say to you, please, Canada, look at what's happened to Europe, look at what's happened to Britain, and don't let it happen to you. Thank you.